So this is probably the most personal video I have ever made on this channel, which scares me a little bit. But if I start crying, it's going to make for a really good clickbait thumbnail. I'm not going to start crying, I promise. In 1999, I was born in a country in the south of Africa called Zimbabwe. Up until about 36 years ago, it was a colony of the UK, and we've had the same guy in charge for the past 37, 38 years. He won't die. It's lit. We have what we like to call a democratic dictatorship, meaning that technically we are a republic and we do have democracy, but somehow the same guy's been in charge for the past 38 years with approval ratings similar to Trump's. That's the dictatorship part. So in 2004, my dad decided that he would move to the UK in search of a better life for me and my mother, and he left us in Zimbabwe and moved. That was really difficult for me because it meant that I wasn't seeing my dad every day, but he sent money back, which meant that life could be pretty lit. I got private education, really cool birthday parties, amazing holidays, and really adorable dresses. So besides the whole abandonment issues, life was great. However, at the end of 2005, with rising political tensions in Zimbabwe, my mum decided that it was probably best that we leave. And so we did, and in January 2006 we moved to the UK, sought asylum and became refugees. I started school in February of 2006, and because of the wonderful private education that my dad had bought me, instead of being there for me, it meant that my English was pretty okay, you know, the whole British colony, teach them our language, give them our names thing, you know, that jazz. But being the new girl in any respect is difficult. Being the new girl in a foreign country, that's painful. Being the new girl in a foreign country in which you're the only black kid in your school, that shit's real. I started school, you know, took it in my stride, tried to learn, and I made friends. One good friend, and he was pretty cool, we would play together. But this one girl, I specifically will always remember her name because mean girls exist even in pint-sized forms of 6-year-olds. She decided that she didn't particularly like me, and one day she came up to me and said I should stop hanging around with this boy because they didn't accept people like me there. 6-year-old me was completely oblivious to what this meant. She was still in that whole everybody's like me bubble, and so I went home and told my parents this. And my parents sat me down, I remember this conversation, and they told me that that things were different now, that I was different, and that things were going to be completely different. And that even though things were changing, I shouldn't change, and that the belief I have in myself shouldn't change. I was like, whatever, that's cool my dudes, I'm gonna go out and play. 6-year-old me wasn't aware of racism, and it wasn't until I was older that I actually understood what this was. And now you're probably being like, what does this, what? Why did you tell us that little story at the beginning? And it's because racism exists, and it's always existed. With recent developments in Charlottesville with L'Oreal and on the platform, I felt kind of like I wanted to start a conversation, continue a conversation about racism, specifically racism in the UK, but also touching on just racism as a whole. Some people will look at my story that I've just said and be like, that was 12 years ago, things have changed, people are different now. But that's not necessarily true. My 10-year-old sister still experiences racism today. With the recent developments I've mentioned, I've been really shocked with people saying that they didn't think that racism still existed today. A part of me was like, what world did you live in? Like, what? Until I took the time to talk to somebody who had this belief, and I asked, why don't you think racism exists? And it became apparent from that conversation and from other things that I've seen online that when people think of racism, they think of slavery, they think of lynching people in the streets, they think of taking people's rights away. But racism has developed, and it now means something completely different. Yes, there is that slavery and there is that taking people's rights away, and there will always be racism, but there is a new form of racism that we must acknowledge exists in our societies. That racism is systematic racism. The kind of racism that exists underlying from lynching people on trees. The kind of racism that presents itself in different walks of life, whether that's education, jobs, or even in hospitals. Systematic racism presents itself in so many different ways. It is how a person of colour with a name that sounds like it belongs to a person of colour will have to send off 16 job applications before they hear one response back. It is how makeup and beauty and drugstores are specifically catered to white people instead of branching out and accepting that we live in this multicultural society. Systematic racism also presents itself in how the media portrays news. It's how a white terrorist is mentally unstable. It's how they've had a difficult start to life. But how any brown terrorist is a Muslim extremist ready to tear down our way of life. Systematic racism also presents itself in our education syllabi. It's how we continue to ignore that a major chunk of British history just didn't happen. It's how we continue to erode the fact that colonization happened, the fact that we also had slaves. It's how we teach about how America has always had awful race relations, that they had slaves, that they had the civil rights movement, but we continue to ignore that we had slaves, we had a civil rights movement, and like America, equality only became a legislative thing in the 1960s. In fact, we implemented it in 1965. It's how we continue to ignore that while America was having Rodney King riots, we were also having riots over Stephen Lawrence. We continue to disregard the fact that foundations of Britain lie and are rooted in racism, in white supremacy. Things like that will forever uphold the system of racism. If we don't acknowledge the fact that these things have occurred in British history, we won't ever be able to move forward. It's how people believe so strongly that racism doesn't exist and isn't apparent anymore, but I can tell you as a BAME person living in the UK that racism is alive and well. Racism is people telling me that I got some of my lower university offers because I'm an ethnic minority and not due to merit or the fact that I could actually be intelligent. Racism is people telling me that I'm pretty for a black girl, as if colour and beauty should have to surrender to each other. I think of so many more instances in my life and in other people's lives where racism presents itself. And I think that the UK has got to stop ignoring the fact that we genuinely have a race problem. Of course, America has a race problem. They have people marching in the streets with torches, calling themselves the KKK, calling themselves neo-Nazi, but we also have these radical right-wing groups, and it's time to stop pretending like we don't. It's time to stop pretending that British history is clean and it's good. It's time to stop pretending that we aren't racist, because some of us are. As I've been talking to people, I've had people say, well, I'm not racist, but in the old cliche, actions speak louder than words. It's time that we stopped supporting a system that upholds racism. The words of Tumblr, it's time to rage against the system. It's time for white people with privilege to acknowledge the fact that they have privilege and that racism isn't a thing of the past and it's a thing that people are still living today, and that you with your privilege can help. Racism is a difficult topic and people get offended at the thought of being called racist. They get offended that ethnic minorities want to say that racism still exists, but race shouldn't be an uncomfortable topic. It should be a topic that we welcome, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to move forward. If we want to say that racism doesn't exist anymore and that we've moved forward from it, we've got to stop upholding a system. We've got to stop having notions that existed 100 years ago, because I can tell you that we haven't moved as far as we want to think we have. I'm not really sure how I bring this video to a close because I'm not exactly sure of the points I've touched on, but I hope that you can see that racism does exist and that we don't need people marching in the streets calling themselves the KKK, adorning themselves with Nazi signs to show that racism does exist. That we can see that it's beyond just lynching people and putting them in slavery. It's a system now. And that we've got to actively work to dismantle that system if you want to move forward in any capacity. I've not said this in a while, but stay woke, kids. Peace.